Hi, I'm Gary Striegler, and I want to talk about something today that is one of the most basic things that a carpenter does, and yet it's simple, but if you don't do it right, it can really cause you a lot of problems, and that's gluing up boards. Now, when I was young, I remember hearing the phrase for the first time that, oh, when you glue up two pieces of wood, that joint is actually stronger than the wood was before you glued it up. That was almost hard to believe. But I can tell you it's absolutely true, and I've proven it time and time again. Now, when I'm talking about gluing up from a trim carpentry standpoint, I'm basically talking about using a glue like this, which when I was a kid, we just called it carpenter's glue, but it's basically is a water-based glue. And these are great because they set up quickly. They give you a very, very strong joint. Now, there's also some versions of it like this is a waterproof glue. I'm getting ready to build an exterior door, so I would definitely want to use a glue like this. But for a whole lot of what I do, I just use something like this original Titebond. So there's some just basic information about what you need to do to get a really good glue joint. One of the first and most obvious things is you need to have the right conditions. That would be you want it to be warm. It's best to be, anywhere from 50 to about 90. And, read the directions on the bottom. They'll cover all that. But you also want to have a very clean surface. Any kind of pollutant, sawdust, or worse yet, something like wax or anything that paint that you might have or on an edge of a board is going to keep the glue from sticking. Now, another important thing is just simply to have a really good, smooth surface. And if I'm gluing something edge to edge, that means that I want to probably at least be joining one edge. Now, here in front of me, I have a glue up, and this is a great example. This is glued up edge to edge, and it's a great example of something I do all the time, whether I'm making a stair tread, whether I'm making maybe a panel for a countertop or a cabinet or whatever. But a lot of times we're going to be gluing up boards edge to edge. Now, I generally like to keep these pieces, there are 3 pieces here, and I generally like to keep those between 4 and say 5.5 inches wide. Another thing that's important, if you can see the end of this board, every board has some growth rings in it. Now, there are boards called, 5/4 lumber that it's close to vertical, but most of the stuff you glue up is going to have some growth rings in the end that you look at. And so what I want to do is I want to alternate on one of these boards, the growth rings are going up, the next one down. So I selected these boards for that. I cleaned the edge up by running one edge on a joiner, and then the other edge I just left with a table saw. Now, it's also really, really important that table saw, I need to make sure that the blade is straight up and down, because if it's, a 1/2 degree off or something, it's going to tend to make these boards want to cup up. And you don't want to be using a really cheap blade. This is an example of a blade that I use. This is a 10-root 50-tooth combination blade. And this one's actually been sharpened, but they stay sharp a long, long time. And I can generally get a very, very good joint, a joint you can't see. If I'll rip, a couple boards in one edge, I'll run through the joiner, and the other one I'll just leave the saw kerf edge. But your boards, when you put them together, you really shouldn't have any big gaps even before you put the glue on them. Now, I just put glue on one edge of these boards and then clamped them up. Now, that's another important thing. Any glue joint that you make is going to have clamping pressure. And what I like to do is have enough pressure so that a little bit of glue squeezes out. I don't know if you can see this or not, but I've got just a tiny bit of glue squeezing out of this. Another thing that's important on an edge-to-edge glue up like this is that I've got one clamp on the bottom, one on top. I'm alternating that, and these pipe clamps do a good job of keeping my glue up flat. Kind of another critical thing, if I want to end up with a 3/4 inch thick or maybe 11/16 inch thick panel, I need to start out with some wood that's maybe an 1/8 or at least a strong 1/16 thicker than that, because as I sand and maybe if I have to run this through the planer, I'm going to lose some thickness. So generally when you're gluing up something like this, you want to start with boards a little thicker than your finished dimension, and you want the glue to be a little bit longer, because you can also end up with snipe at the end. And I like to clamp at least every foot on something like this. There's some things I want to clamp, every 6 or 8 inches. Just depends on what I'm doing. But I probably could have gotten by maybe with one less clamper, but I wanted to make sure I was able to alternate between the top and the bottom. These are pipe clamps. They're probably the most economical clamp you can use, and you can put a whole lot of pressure on with a pipe clamp. So these are great. Now, for what I'm doing right here, I'm not really worried about protecting the edge, although some of these clamps do have a pad. But that's one thing we're going to want to think about as we're going through looking at these other glue-up examples. It's the fact that sometimes you need to protect the edge of your wood depending on how fragile it is, because when you start putting a lot of clamping pressure on, you're going to possibly leave an indentation in the wood if you don't protect it. So I'm going to slide this out of the way. So another type of glue up that we do quite regularly is this. And this is where I'm attaching a piece of solid lumber to a piece of plywood, and that's to cover the end grain of the plywood. The primary example for this would be something like building a cabinet, maybe building a fireplace mantle, a pilaster, but we do this pretty regularly. And one of the things that I have learned from time is I don't try to make a perfectly flush joint here. What I'll do instead is let this face of the wood stick out a little bit beyond this plywood, and then I'll come back with a flush trim router bit and trim it. You can see I've got a little bit of glue oozing out here. And to me, that's why I normally get a good joint if I get just a little bit of squeeze out. On this, I got probably a little more than a little bit of squeeze out, but I'd rather have too much glue than not enough. This type of clamp is really good. These are I call them K-body clamps. And I get wide clamping pressure, and they have pads on that won't indent my face frame. So like this one, I'm gluing a piece of solid wood to a piece of plywood. This could even be a shelf. I like these K-body clamps, and they do a good job. I can't probably put quite as much pressure as I can with a pipe clamp simply because my grip's not as good as it once was. Want to mention this real quick too. It's a great idea to own a good heavy-duty glue scraper, because you want to be able to scrape some of that excess glue off before you start routing or sanding, because dry glue is hard on any kind, whether it be your planer knives or even your sandpaper contents to clog it up. So own a good glue scraper and scrape off as much of the glue as you can. One thing that I might mention, it depends on the time of the year and your conditions, but a lot of these glues will set. I've done some where I had a joint I couldn't move in even 10 minutes. It's probably a good rule of thumb just generally to leave things glued up for about an hour. What I'll do a lot of times is when I glue something up, I'll just take a pencil and write down the time. If you're gluing up several things, then you don't have to go back and go, oh, when did I do that? Is it all right to unclamp it? So it's a great idea. Just write down the time. And even in the hottest part of the summer, I'll generally give it a half an hour. But if you want to experiment sometime, clamp a couple boards together and come back in about 10 minutes and see if you can get them to come apart. You're probably going to find out that they actually don't want to come apart. Now, another type of gluing that I do, we've kind of looked at edge to edge. And we've also looked at like a plywood edge to a solid wood edge, but face to face. An example of that is like these are two boards that I put together to make a thicker board to build a door. I find that putting multiple boards together instead of buying one thick piece of lumber works a lot better because it's more stable. It's kind of like a piece of plywood is more stable than just a piece of solid lumber. So when I do something like this, especially wider, sometimes I have to go up 10-inch wide boards, I'm still going to use a clamp like this and spread them out down the edge. But then I'll use something like this C-clamp to get some clamping pressure out in the middle, especially as I get to wider boards. Now, something like this is always thicker and a little bit rough, so I don't worry as much about having to pad it. But a C-clamp is probably going to give you some indentations if you start putting too much clamping pressure on. Again, my goal was basically just to squeeze it until the boards go together and I see some glue squeeze out. So another type of gluing up that we do is where I'm putting end grain to edge. Now, this board, this grain, that's the way the water was going in the tree, when it was growing. And so it tends to really suck the glue in. And most people will tell you that, if I wanted to glue two boards together like this, end to end, I probably would not get a very strong joint. And I need to do something to help reinforce that joint. Now, a much more common joint is one like I'm going to show you here, where like building a door, cabinet door, or anything, I'm going to have end grain on one side. Right here, see, I've got end grain going into edge grain. And if I want a strong joint there, the glue will hold a little bit on that edge grain, but I want to put something there to support that joint. And it's not new, it's been around a while, but one of the tools that does a great job is the Festool Domino, because I'm inserting a piece of wood that has that edge grain all the way around it into this hole in the end grain. And now back inside that hole, I'm actually back to having that kind of that edge grain to edge grain. So when it comes over and makes contact with this, I'm going to get some strength out of the end grain to face grain. I'm going to get a lot of strength out of this domino. Dowels are another way of doing this. To some degree, biscuits are, but the domino does a great job of it. Plus, it allows me to get a lot more depth in my cut as opposed to a biscuit. And as far as a dowel, a dowel sort of has the same strength, but man, are they unforgiving. You have to get everything lined up just right. So that's a great example. If I'm doing, edge grain to end grain, I want to put something in there. The mortise and tenon joint's the same, but much harder to pull off. A cabinet door is another example of that. If you look at the cabinet door, though, the machining, the tools I used to, what I did with routers, with shapers, creates a cope and stick cut. And what that cope and stick cut does, it turns it from just being an end grain to an edge grain, because this cope part sticks up in between the face of the cabinet style, and lets the rail actually have some joint where it's face grain to face grain instead of end grain to edge grain. So that's kind of the principle behind that. Again, same thing with something like this. I want to make sure I have a little bit of glue squeezing out, and see, clamping this up would be a great example of something where I for sure want to use a K-body clamp that's got, the pads to protect it. And I may even want to put, depending on how fragile this wood is, if it was pine or something, I would want to put a pad, which basically is a thin piece of wood it's going to get smashed instead of my finished product. Well, there's one more type of gluing that I do, and that's laminating. For me, that's when I'm making something that's curved. I'm going to just bring in an example of that and talk about it for just a minute. So now this is an example of a form that I might use to make a curved glue up. And there's all kinds of forms. This is one that I use. And it's basically some metal L brackets, homemade metal L brackets that are on a radius. And then I would take pieces of wood like this. Now, generally, I'm going to use at least 5 layers. Like if I was making up a curved door jamb or something. When I do curved casing trims, I'm going to use probably 10 or 15, but a whole bunch. And how thick these boards are kind of depends on how tight the radius is, and a little bit even what type of board they are. But I'm not going to get into this too much other than to say, this again is gluing face to face, and I'm going to put it around a form like this, Now, when you're doing that wide and that many strips, it's a great idea to have a glue roller like this. It's got a hopper you fill with glue, and then you just roll it till you get a really good covering of glue, and then you're ready to put the strips together. Now, you only need to have glue on one strip. It's the same thing when I'm doing, any of the gluing that I've shown there, the edge gluing, whatever. I don't need to put glue on both edges or both faces. If I put glue on this face and put it to that takes care of it. Again, I want to see a little bit of squeeze out when I'm done. Now, the only other thing that I want to talk about on this is just that this piece of metal spans from point to point, but the next piece of metal going around the outside reinforces the fibers of the wood, because anytime that you're bending a piece of wood fibers don't stretch, they compress. So I need to by having this piece of metal, it reinforces the wood fibers, doesn't let them blow out on the outside, and makes them compress on the inside. So there's a lot that I could share about this, but I just want to share kind of the basics of this type of glove, which is laminating things. The amazing part is, once you've laminated something, especially a piece of casing trim out of a whole bunch of layers, it won't move at all. Now, a door jamb that's maybe 4 or 5 layers, I always try to make a door jamb 5 layers, may move a little bit, but one of the great things about being a carpenter as opposed to a furniture maker, I get to hold the curved pieces I make in place with another piece or by putting in the wall. So I'm not going to say that's everything that you need to know about gluing, but I've tried to share a whole bunch of what's one of the most basic things we do, and yet it's one of the most important, because a great glue joint will allow you to create tremendous work. A bad glue joint will ruin your project.